So, welcome everyone. This is the second video in the sports psychology series for personality. Thank you for coming back and spending this time with me. If you remember in our last video, we were talking about the term personality, what it might mean, where the word comes from, and some of the ways that we've sought to explain personality. At this point here, I wanted to share with you what Hollander, who is a psychologist, what Hollander suggested the structure of a person's personality is made up of. Now what Hollander did, he gave us a model, and in that model he started in the middle, and he called this the psychological core. The psychological core. Now, what he meant by this was that this is what we often term the real you. And this contains all of our beliefs and values. Hollander then gave us our second layer, and he called this our typical responses. Now, what he means by typical responses are how do we normally react when faced with a certain situation. How we normally react, or to give it its correct term, behave, our normal behaviour. Now, as an example, let's say that most of us know right from wrong. We know it's wrong to steal, for example. So that's our psychological core, and our typical response would normally be, if we saw someone stealing, to raise an alarm, to call the police, to tell someone, or even to tackle them ourselves and say, hey, stop doing that. That's wrong. But because of the last layer, what we call our role-related behaviour, sometimes we don't follow our typical responses. If I just come back here and I were to number these, so because of our role-related behaviour, we don't always show our typical responses. And our role-related behaviour is influenced by outside factors. In football, perhaps we're a captain on a football team. Now, our psychological core is quite an aggressive one, which would normally mean that if we were fouled, our typical responses might normally be to kick out or to seek retribution or revenge. But because the manager is made as a captain, we don't. Now, we talked about trait theories. In fact, we talked about a lot of different theories. As at this point here, I want to go into a bit more detail. So we've got a structure of what our personality is made up of, Now we need to explain why that's the case. So, if you remember, our first theory was trait theories. And we remember a trait is a relatively stable or innate characteristic that we inherited from our parents. So when we talk about trait theories, we want to talk about Eysenck. So Eysenck's trait theory. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to get a picture to help you with that. Now what Eysenck suggested was that we could categorize traits on different scales. Now if I draw on here in black pen, he actually gave us two different scales themselves. He gave us this scale. I'll just draw out a straight line for you. So from being at one end of the scale being very stable and showing very stable characteristics, things like being even tempered, so we don't suddenly fly off the handle, all the way up to being very unstable, so we could measure ourselves on that scale. The other scale is what we call the introvert-extrovert scale. So here we've got the stable-unstable scale. Here we've got the introvert-extrovert. Now, introverted behaviour is what we might call very outgoing behaviour. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. Extroverted behaviour is what we might call very outgoing behaviour. Introverted behaviour is what we might call very shy behaviour. And you've probably heard those terms before, being an introvert or an extrovert. So Eysenck suggested what we could then do is come up with these broad categories, and we could actually classify someone, for example, as being an unstable extrovert. So if I highlight that here, you'll be able to see exactly what I mean. So we could categorize someone who shows these characteristics as being a unstable extrovert. Equally, we could classify someone who shows these sort of characteristics as being a stable introvert. And of course we could do the same with unstable introverts and stable extroverts. So that's Eysenck's trait theory, and that sits as one of a number of different trait approaches. Okay, let's take another theory. Let's look at the situational approaches. The classic situational approach is Bandura. So Bandura's social learning theory. Now, I could spend hours talking about this, but you'll be glad to know that I'm not going to. The key thing for us to pick up here is that Bandura suggested that rather than inheriting these things from our parents, yes, we still have them. Yes, we could still classify ourselves in this way, but it was the belief that they came from somewhere different. And he said we actually learnt them. And what we actually do is that we, in some sense, model ourselves. We might say that we replicate other other people's behaviour. And if you think about it, that's not too challenging a thought. Why is it that a baby could grow up to speak any language depending on where they're born? Why? Because they just copy their parents. They copy those of people who are around them. And it's the same idea here. But the important thing as well is that there is some sort of reinforcement. Now, that reinforcement could be a reward in some way. Or it could be a punishment. So we reinforce what is negative behaviour, the sort of things we don't want people to do, by punishing them. We reward the positive behaviour that we want people to replicate to try and get them to do it again. And these rewards could either be physical things we can actually have, or they could be something that is non-physical, something we can't touch, such as praise. What's important to recognise, though, is that sometimes this non-physical, it could just be pride. So we could actually give a reward for something a child does. What we've got to also recognise is they might just get some sort of satisfaction or pride out of doing something. So we've got two different schools of thought there, all still coming back to this same idea that we can rate ourselves or categorise ourselves in a certain way. And of course, yes, who sits in the middle? Our interactional theories. Okay, who believe that that our personality comes from a blend of the two. So rather than getting it from our parents, or definitely getting it from learnt, we get it from a blend of both. Okay, that's the broad detail of what we looked at before, and with some more specific theories. What you need to do is go in and make sure you can describe these in as much detail as possible. Okay, we are now going to consider some slightly more modern views, and that is by someone called Martins, and it's Martins's schematic view. And Martins built on the work of Hollander. So we can see Hollander's structure here with these same things. Martins did the same. He saw there was a lot of value in that, but he wanted to try and explain why these things happen and build us a better model. So what he did was to give us a model that was actually now in a triangle. And what he said is, at our base is our psychological core. So psychological core. He then said, above that, sitting on top of that, are the typical responses. And then he said, we've got our role-related behaviour. So you can see very similar, just organised a different way. So what's now key to making this the schematic view is to try and flesh this out a bit. what Martin said there is, obviously outside of us, is our social environment. And that sits outside of all of us. I'm going to put it this side as well, just to reinforce this idea as I build this model up. And we can now add that all of this role-related behaviour is external and it's dynamic. It's ever changing. It's never staying the same. Yet down here in my psychological core, this is actually very internal. And as a result, it's stable or constant. And the further we move away from the psychological core, the more we get affected by the external and dynamic world around us. And that has a major impact on our behaviour. Or you might say how we perform. The last thing that I want to talk to you about today is the idea that it's all very well us understanding where personality comes from, all of these things, what makes our personality, being able to explain why our personality is that way. But for sport, what we need to understand is that we have two types of personality. We have type A and we have type B. So we have type A personalities and type B personalities. Now, it's useful for us to think of this as a continuum. We are not one or the other. We have bits of both maybe. So a type A personality is going to be very competitive. And that's quite important, especially for sport. Typically, our type A personality displays lower levels of depression. We're generally more upbeat about things. We also have a high desire to achieve goals. We want to do well. And we will happily multi-task. Now, for this reason, because of these things, we refer to this sort of person as a gold medal athlete or a gold medal personality, because these attributes are very, very good for sport. Conversely, our type B personalities tend to be very tolerant of others, something that type A also isn't. We tend to be more relaxed, not so urgent about things. If we're a type B, we tend to be less competitive. We also tend to experience lower levels of anxiety. And when we study anxiety, we will probably start to realise why actually, although we think of anxiety as being bad, actually we do need some anxiety. We do need to have some worries in our life if we are going to really push ourselves forward. So, to broadly sum up, Hollander gave us our structure. Eysenck, Bandura and interactional theorists tried to explain why our personality is built that way, using different theories. More recently, Martins has built upon Hollander's work to then help us understand how our personality is influenced by what goes on around us. And finally, we can say here this is a piece of work done by Cox, and he built on Raymond Cattell's narrow band theory. We've got a continuum between the gold medal athlete and the also-rans based on their characteristics. So that's it from me. I thank you for joining me. Look forward to seeing you again.